Good morning, everyone. This is Susie Vandereet with St. Louis Native Plants, here to talk a little bit about our insect pollinators. I have my coffee in hand, and I am dressed appropriately in bee fashion to celebrate Pollinator Week, which is basically a way for us to talk about and celebrate different pollinators, and also to talk about ways that we can support and protect them. So I am launching my new series called The Breakfast Buzz, and I'm going to be featuring some different pollinators, and specifically insect pollinators, throughout the course of this series. So if you want to learn a bit about how to protect them and support them even more than maybe you already do, then we're going to be talking about some of those tips and different things to incorporate into your home landscape to help support these little beings. So first, I would like to talk a little bit about the bees. The most important thing that you can do to help a species to thrive is to provide its ideal habitat. And there are lots of ways that we can do this in our own yards to support insect pollinators. It's really, their needs are not very different from our own. We require food, we require shelter, space, place to reproduce, and we require a poison-free environment. And so when you look at what that means and how that translates to insect pollinators, that means that they need flowers and sometimes other insects for food. They require space, like areas for nesting and overwintering sites and shelter from predators and from inclement weather. And then they also require that we don't spray them with insecticides, and try to be a little bit more conscientious about how we're using those products. And so right now we're looking at a native wild hydrangea, which is Hydrangea arborescens. And this gets so much bee activity this time of year. As long as these shrubs are blooming, we get all kinds of, especially bumblebees and a lot of other pollinators like wasps and beetles and flies as well. I don't see as much in the way of butterflies and moths on this, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. So specifically highlighting bees today, bees are going to be feeding their young on pollen, and they themselves are going to be looking for nectar, especially, maybe a little bit of pollen as well in their adult form. And so having a multitude of specifically native plants blooming throughout the growing season is going to be the most ideal scenario for them as far as foraging goes, and having enough food to feed themselves as well as their young. So having this hydrangea is really great for this time of year, but then as soon as this stops blooming, there need to be other plants that are going to be blooming that support these pollinators as well. And so this could be things like purple coneflower. Actually, I will use that as one example, as a really great bumblebee magnet, basically, and they just seem to love it. I also have a clematis vine in the backyard that seems to be really ideal for them, but it is a native, it's Clematis versicolor, actually. And so having plants like this to kind of take over as one stops blooming and the other start blooming is really the most ideal scenario for them for foraging. And then when we talk about space, there are some different nesting sites that we can provide, and I'm going to move to a different area to demonstrate that. When we're talking about nesting sites for bees, we know that 70% of our bee species require ground for nesting sites, and that the other 30% will nest in things like rotting wood or hollowed stems, things like that. And so when we look at this hydrangea, something I want you to note is that somewhere in here, I'm going to set my coffee down, we have stems that I actually pruned before that are hollowing out. And this is something that you'll see with a lot of different plants, that their spent growth or their growth from last year that's dormant, the pith, that center, that soft center, will start to hollow out, and bees and beetles will actually use that as nesting materials. And so that's one way that we can support them, is leaving some of our stems standing year to year so that they can actually use that for nesting. We can also mimic this with human-made bee habitat. And so you can see some of these holes are actually filled in with mud. Some of them, and some of the other ones that I have, are filled in with leaf matter and leaf debris. And there's actually a little parasitic wasp on here right now. I don't know if you can see that. But anyway, so we can provide these actually to mimic what they would find in their natural environment. Specifically the 30% of bees that are going to be looking for those hollowed out stems or rotting wood. Okay, so when we talk about ground nesting bees, those 70% of ground nesting bees that make up our native bee species, they will need something like bare ground. And that means we need to stop using mulch, a ton of mulch everywhere in our gardens, and also not use things like weed barrier, which honestly don't really work well anyway. And you will start to see little excavations with holes, entrance points and exit points in these excavations in the bare ground that you leave open for them. This is just something, for soil health too, that's really useful to have. But 70% of our bees are ground nesters, and so that's a lot of our bee species that require bare ground for nesting sites. So the more that you can leave bare ground, and you'll see that this whole hillside has a lot of bare ground. I do not mulch this hillside here, and as these grasses are filling in, that's something that gradually will help to suppress more weed growth and do that sort of thing. But otherwise, I'm not covering the soil up so that bees can freely use it for a nesting site. Another aspect of a good habitat for bees and other pollinators is to provide some sort of vegetation for them to overwinter in, and some of this could mean leaving leaves behind, a little bit of leaf debris, for them to actually take shelter in so that they can cool more gradually as our temperatures really cool down. And this basically is their winter coat. So, but we also can provide bunch grasses or tussock grasses that are kind of clump forming, and you can see a lot of these on this hillside here. And so this is going to be a really good place for things like bees and other pollinators, other insect pollinators, to actually take shelter in. Sometimes bumblebees will even use grasses similar to this to nest underneath as well. They'll kind of go around this edge, and you see all of this fallen debris here, and they will actually go underneath it, and there might be a little burrow or a little cavity underneath there, and they will create their new colony. The fertilized queen will create her new colony year to year in a place like that. They also could use former rodent burrows, or be under a rock, something like that as well. And lastly, as we wrap up here, I want to mention that the last characteristic of a good habitat for a bee and a lot of other insect pollinators is going to be that it is a poison-free environment, the same as we require. And so when we think of what that means, it means that we need to not be outside liberally spraying insecticides, that's going to have impacts on them. Even if we're spraying for something like mosquitoes, that's not necessarily just going to single out mosquitoes. And that we also need to look out when we're putting things down like grub killer and those sorts of things. Ooh, I just had a little carpenter bee checking me out. It's kind of thrown by my costume. Anyways, so we just need to really make sure that when we're putting that stuff outside, that we realize the far-reaching impacts of that, and that can even it can affect other wildlife around the food web, because there are a number of things that also eat bees. So we just have to really keep that in mind and do our research if we're going to be using something like that outdoors. So anyways, that is probably going to conclude and wrap up for today, and I hope to do a lot more of these to help people understand kind of the importance of supporting these things, and also just that we can, that this isn't something that's beyond our control. So hope everybody has a great pollinator week, and look forward to seeing you on the next edition of Breakfast Buzz.